Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Gnostic Studies. And we're going to do a lecture today, part 3 of our introduction or intermediate studies in Gnostic Psychology. So let's see what we got here. And we're studying impressions. This is class 3. So let's look at the general topic for the intermediate studies series. There are 10 classes, 2 on influences, 2 on impressions. The 5th one, self-observation and the 3 brains. Then we're going to look at the mind and the intellect, the emotions, habits and actions, and finally the wrong working of the centers in the so-called abuse of sex. So, a general review or a general examination of these topics allows us to understand that what we're studying in this second part, which is called Intermediate Studies in Gnostic Psychology. The second phase, because the first was the introduction, and if you haven't studied that, we recommend that you review that material. What we're studying in the second phase, intermediate, is the human machine. We want to understand this organism that we have that's inside the physical world or exists in the physical world, and that we have the ability to govern or control through so-called normal means and as well as through so-called esoteric means. So, what the purpose of Gnosis is to enable us. Before we jump into today's material, which again is about impressions, let's do a quick review of influences, which we studied in the past class. We talked about how we can not necessarily stop influences, but we can choose the influence to which we wish to subject ourselves. So we'll see that in general this is the sort of key to proceeding. Because influences, as is implied in the word, have an influence upon us. So whatever we choose, because we can choose, to influence us, will have an effect on us. So we're looking at cause and effect relationships. We need to pick those influences that are going to lead in the direction that we want to head. Basically, what we said was that we live in a very difficult place in the universe because we exist in the almost at the very end of the universe when compared with the absolute. So the absolute, or absolutely everything, is the do of the cosmic octave. Then we have the si, the la, sol, fa, and we exist in the mi of the cosmic octave because we exist on the earth. So we exist pretty far away from where everything is united, a complete unity in the absolute. So the goal as a Gnostic is to reconnect with the absolute, to reconnect with divinity and to unite ourselves, to self-realize ourselves. So that process is passing through certain stages or levels or something similar to grades or degrees in other systems. Although this system is very specific about what it is. So we live in a very bad place or a very difficult place in the universe, and in order for us to change our position, we need to work on ourselves. And the beginning of that work is choosing the influences. The next step is understanding impressions, which is what we're going to study for this class and the preceding class. So energy descends from the absolute and eventually establishes itself in what we call our planetary world, which is our Earth, and we exist on the surface of the Earth in so-called organic life on Earth. That's our role, or that's our place, and our role is to transform energies that come from the cosmos, from above, and then digest them and retransmit them into the Earth so that the interior of the Earth can receive them, because the Earth is an organism, just like us. And so that's our role, but if we want to change our position, if we want to stop just doing that as a role, we can do that, but we have to understand how to do that in order to be successful at it. And so to sort of summarize, we'll just jump down to the bottom, that there's these different types of influences. We can categorize influences into 3 different types: type A, type B, and type C. Type A influences are prejudices of humanities, laws of the physical world, business rules, everything that is even called family, environment, etc. It's related to the physical world. Those are what type A influences are. Type B influences are different. They are formed from different esoteric currents or occultist type of schools. You could consider these Gnostic classes as a type B influence. And then there are type C influences, which are formed by something different from mechanical humanity. Type C influences come directly from conscious humanity. So type A influences are related with mechanical humanity. Type C influences are related to conscious humanity. If we want to connect with conscious humanity, if we want to stop being robots, machines, pushed here and there by various influences, puppets moved by the planets or by whatever other influences come to us from media, from the internet, from social or cultural pressures, etc., then we need to connect with these type C influences. And the way to do that is to work with type B influences, to study type B influences until we find those specific ones that stimulate something in us, because the purpose of type B influences is to access type C influences, to stimulate that longing in us and give us the techniques that allow us to access type C influences. Type B influences awaken in the aspirant a very special emotion, which leads them to work upon themselves in order to achieve the awakening of the consciousness. And thus someday they will get into the mesoteric circle and later on into the esoteric circle. We're talking about entering into the real esotericism. The path to return to divinity is very personal. It's not something that we necessarily discuss with anybody else. We have experiences both in the external world and internally that we may not share or shouldn't share. But as you know, this system that we're studying is all about the awakening of the consciousness, saying that our consciousness is asleep. And so that brings us to today's class, which is related with the 3 types of nourishment, impressions, and reactions. We've talked about influences and that we can choose. There is the possibility of choosing influences. Today we're going to look at another possible category of influence, which we could call impressions. It's an important subject for us to understand. They're often considered data we receive from the external world, although we could have internal impressions as well. But often we consider impressions to be things we receive through the senses, through our eyes and ears, through taste, sound, hearing, taste, touch, smell. And then those enter into us through the input mechanism, which is our senses, and then they do something on the inside. So we're going to look at that process. What happens when we receive impressions through our senses? That's what we're going to look at today. Because we want to understand what the human machine normally does with impressions. Because then we can understand that there's a possibility of doing something different with them. Again, the idea is that we have a human machine, we have an opportunity, we have a position that we have been given in the cosmos, but we can change our position. And in order to change that position, we need to do something, doing. And so that requires understanding what we're going to do, implementing it, as well as the obstacles we may encounter along the way. And all of this is part of a deconditioning process. We need to decondition ourselves from what culture in these times has explained to us existence is for. Why do we exist? This is a question that we should decide for ourselves. And Gnosis has some ideas about it. But as you know, if you've been studying and following these classes, the idea is that we can become different beings, different types of beings. And essentially get off the wheel of samsara, stop suffering, end our suffering, and assist humanity in ending its suffering as well. But it's a process that each one of us needs to do individually. And so we need to become familiar with that deconditioning process. We want to understand how to look at the world differently. Not in the way that everybody thinks it should be seen or tells us we should look at it. Because part of that is understanding how the human machine works or functions, and we want to investigate that. So we'll begin today with understanding impressions. Before we do that, remember that what Gnosis says is that our consciousness is trapped in ego, in the psychic aggregates, which is like saying fixed ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. Our consciousness is trapped, and we need to free it from mechanical ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. So we say that these fixed ways or mechanical ways of thinking, feeling, and acting are related to different egoic states. We want to observe those egoic states in us. In a book called Revolution of the Dialectic, the first chapter, there's a section called States of the Ego. And what happens is when we get identified with these egos, we cause ourselves to suffer, we cause others to suffer. And so we want to understand them as states that we have internally, internal states. External world has events in it. The internal world has states, internal states, states of ourselves. I believe we discussed this in part 5 of the introduction series, States and Events. So what does it say in the Revolution of the Dialectic book? It says, the states of the ego are classified in the following manner. Sensory-based or stereopsychic egos, the identifying states which are intimately related with exterior perceptions that are received through the five senses and which are connected with the world of impressions. So we have egos that are directly related to how we receive information with the senses, how sounds, colors, smells, or sensations seem to us. Oh, I like red, I don't like blue, or I like blue, I don't like green, or whatever it is. I like this flavor, I don't like that flavor. I like this sensation, I don't like that sensation. And if we really want to work on ourselves and free ourselves from all our attachments, then we have to look at those things. So there's these three different states. The first is the sensory-based or stereopsychic egos. The second, interpretation-based or neopsychic, the data processing states. In other words, those which properly interpret or misinterpret all the multiple situations that the intellectual animal lives. Our bad secretary, the personality, works in these states. So once we receive impressions, once we receive information through our senses, then it enters into us, and then we interpret it or misinterpret it. How we process information, and specifically how we mechanically interpret situations or events through our false personality. We say that the personality is false because it is not something that's eternal. It's connected to the physical body that we have in this particular lifetime. It is not something that's eternal. And so we want to deconstruct it as well. So an example of this, nowadays everybody's very much focused on economics, right, and money. And people say things like, well, this person owes me money, and if they're not paying me, it's because they don't respect me. And they think that I'm soft or I'm weak, right? I'm interpreting that. And they think that I'm going to let it slide, but I'm not, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to do this to them. I'm going to do that to them. I'm going to, make a big deal out of it. I'm not going to do this or that. So all of it is interpreting situations instead of, well, maybe the person doesn't have the money. Maybe that's why they haven't paid me back, because they don't have the money. Or maybe they forgot, or whatever it is. But interpretation, how we interpret things, that's the second type of egos that we have within ourselves. And the third type is memory-based or archaeopsychic. They are the regressive states, memory of the ego, which are found in the 49 levels of the subconsciousness. They are the memories of the past, which are generally filed in a photographic, which is image-based, and a phonographic or sound-based manner. What does that mean? We talked about memory also in the Introduction to Gnostic Psychology series related with roles. Memory is impressions that we've filed away and stored according to certain associations. Archaeopsychic or memorial egoic states are related to associations we have with certain sights, sounds, smells, tastes, sensations, etc. from the stereopsychic or sensory egoic states and the interpretation neopsychic or interpretive egoic states. So how we interpreted things and then associated them together with something similar or the opposite in our mind. As an example, in the morning, my father or my grandfather always used to drink a cup of coffee and read the newspaper. Right? Nowadays, people look at their phone. So maybe it's different, but if you've had that experience, you can remember the smell, because the ink that they used on the newspaper, and the paper itself had a certain smell to it, and the smell of the coffee. So that smell of coffee, smell of the newspaper, or smell of smoking cigarettes, or whatever people do, right, when they get up, maybe as a child we see that and then we associate that with adulthood or with the morning, getting up in the morning. And so now we have those associations. We have them stored, filed away in our memory as, oh, that's what being an adult is, or that's what, wake up in the morning, you have coffee, or you wake up in the morning, you look at the newspaper. That's what you do. And so we have to break those things down and say, well, that's what my father or my grandfather did, but it's not what everybody does. You don't have to do that. I could wake up in the morning and pray, or I could wake up in the morning and meditate or exercise, or do whatever. So we just went over those three states: sensory-based, interpretation-based, and memory-based. Three different egoic states related to our internal state, in order for us to understand why we're doing this work. We're going to look at the first one, which is related with impressions. And in the other classes, we'll see more about associations. The memory is sort of like how things are stored. So what may happen when we're meditating on an ego, we're meditating on something that happened to us, let's say today or yesterday, and then a memory may come up from the past. What we'll be able to do is see the association that's being given to us between the event that happened today and the event from the past, and then be able to work through or transform those impressions, transform those memories from being categorized or associated in one way into another way. So that not only can we transform and comprehend today's experience, but also what happened in the past. It's very, very useful. So anyway, that's why we're studying this stuff today. So let's jump into it, reading from chapter 1, section called The Transformation of Impressions in Revolution of the Dialectic. We're going to talk about the transformation of life. And this is possible if one profoundly resolves to transform oneself. Transformation means that one thing changes into another different thing. Everything is susceptible to change. Sugar is transformed into alcohol, and alcohol is converted into vinegar, all by means of the action of fermentation. This is the transformation of a molecular substance. The alchemists of the Middle Ages spoke about the transmutation of lead into gold. However, they did not always refer to the merely metallic physical matter. Normally, they wanted to indicate the transmutation of the lead of the personality into the gold of the spirit. In the Gospels, the terrestrial man is compared to a seed that is capable of growth. And this has the same meaning as the idea of the rebirth of the man who is born again. If we study biology, then we know that if the grain or seed does not die, then the plant is not born. Death and birth exist in every transformation. This is why we talk about dying to the ego, elimination of the ego, so that we can be born in a different way, related with that aspect of consciousness that's trapped within that ego. In Gnosis, we consider the human organism to be like a factory with 3 floors, which normally absorbs 3 different types of food or nourishment. Ordinary food corresponds to the first floor, related with the physical stomach. Air corresponds to the lungs, which is the second floor. And impressions are associated with the third floor, or the brain. So we're talking about the stomach, the lungs, and the brain. And the types of food that go to them are food, air, and impressions. Impressions, air, and physical food enable the organism to live to the end of its normal term of life and to produce the substances necessary not only for the maintenance of life, but also for the creation and growth of higher bodies. We mentioned this before, that there's different types of human beings, and that in order for us to do the work upon ourselves and do the self-realization, we need to create these superior bodies. Solar bodies, they're also called. Solar astral, solar mental, solar causal bodies. The food which we eat goes through successive transformations. The process of life in itself and by itself is transformation. Each creature of the universe lives by means of the transformation of one substance into another. Let's reflect on that. Each creature of the universe lives by means of the transformation of one substance into another. The plant, for example, transforms water, the air and the salts of the earth into new vital vegetable substances, into elements which are useful to us, such as nuts, fruits, potatoes, lemons, etc. Therefore, everything is transformation. Through the action of the solar light, the fermentation of nature varies. The sensitive film of life, also called organic life on Earth, which normally extends over the face of the Earth, leads every universal force towards the very interior of the planetary organism. This is called the ray of creation in descent. We talked about this a little bit at the beginning today, because we talked about the ray of creation in descent related with the absolute. So another way to look at this is as concentric circles. So if we exist very close to the center, all of those energies or forces, universal forces, are descending, coming from the outside towards the inside. Each plant, each insect, each creature, and even the human being absorbs and assimilates specific cosmic energies and then transforms them, as well as unconsciously transmits them to the inferior layers of the planetary organism, right, into the earth. Such transformed energies are intimately related with the whole economy of the planetary organism in which we live. So we have an economy related with money in each country, right? In each province or state, and maybe in our local county or city, we have an economy. But what this is talking about is the same concept of exchanges of energy, of transfers of substances and energies, but related with our planetary organism. The planet. Something we don't learn about in school. Every creature, according to its species, transforms specific energies, which it then transmits to the interior of the earth for the economy of the world. Therefore, each creature that has existence fulfills a function. Right? We mentioned this already. We ourselves have a function. Just like each insect, each plant, each dog or cat or whatever, to transform energies and give them to the earth. When we eat a food necessary for our existence, then it is clearly transformed from one phase into another, into all of those elements which are so indispensable for our existence. What carries out these processes of the transformation of substances within us? Obviously, the Instinctive Center. The wisdom of this center is really astonishing. Digestion in itself is transformation. The food in the stomach, in the inferior part of this three-story factory of the human organism, goes through a transformation. We call it digestion, right? But when something is not transformed properly, we call it indigestion. We get indigestion when we eat something and it doesn't get transformed properly. We're not able to extract the vital nutrients from it. This is why the food we eat needs to undergo a transformation in order to be converted into blood and hormones, vitamins, minerals, protein, lipids, right, fats, carbohydrates, sugar, glucose, all those things. This is what biology talks to us about, that transformational process. The air we breathe also undergoes a certain process of transformation in the lungs, related with the blood. Deoxygenated blood comes to the lungs, which is then oxygenated through respiration. That's so-called blue blood. The blue blood, the red blood has oxygen in it. Blue blood, sometimes you see it in the veins, which are returning the blood that transmitted the oxygen to whatever part of the body it was going to. The blue blood needs oxygen. It doesn't have it. And so it's sent to the lungs via the heart in order to be reoxygenated, and then it's sent back to the heart, and then the heart pumps it back out to whatever part of the body it needs to go to. And in that process, the waste products are exhaled. As we exhale, and then we inhale new air to provide the necessary elements to the lungs, which in turn passes them on to the blood, which is then circulated around the body thanks to the heart. So food is transformed, right? The food we eat is transformed through the mouth. We chew it, we swallow it, it goes into the stomach, it's digested in the stomach and in the intestines, and then certain parts are extracted for use and certain parts are left to be peed and pooped out. The air, we take in air, we give that energy or oxygen and whatever other elements, because it's probably not just oxygen, to the blood that's transferred through the lungs, and then we exhale the other elements that are sent to us from the deoxygenated blood. So there's a process there also of transformation. So what about the third process? We said the stomach, the lungs, and the brain, right? So this third process is related with impressions. It is clear that physical foods are transformed and that air is also transformed. But there is something which invites us to reflection. Does an educated transformation of impressions exist within us? Do we transform the impressions that we receive? For the purpose of nature itself, there is no need whatsoever for us to transform impressions. But we can transform impressions by ourselves by comprehending the reason why this is necessary. It is magnificent to transform impressions. The majority of people believe that the physical world will give them what they yearn for and seek. But really, this is a tremendous error. Life in itself enters into us, into our organism, in the form of impressions. Life enters into us in the form of impressions. The first thing that we should comprehend is the significance of the world of impressions and how this is intimately related with the esoteric work. One cannot really transform one's life unless one transforms the impressions which reach the mind. We're talking about something very revolutionary because the entire world believes that the physical is what is real. But if we go a little deeper, we see that what we're really receiving at each moment are just impressions. If we see a person that pleases us or displeases us, the first thing that we obtain are the impressions of them. We see them, right? The images of them, the sounds of them. Life is a successive series of impressions, and not an exclusively materialistic type of thing as is believed by many people nowadays. People think that life is material, but what we're looking at here is that life is a successive series of impressions that we're receiving from the so-called material world or physical world, which means that the reality of life is in its impressions. It is clear that this may not be easy to grasp at first. Most people feel that life exists as it is, or they perceive it to be, or as they perceive it to be, and not as its impressions. They are so influenced by this physical world that this is how they think. The person that we see seated in front of us, for example, the one who greets us, the one who smiles at us, etc., are really real for us. But if we meditate profoundly on all of them, we arrive at the conclusion that what is real for us are the impressions of them. These impressions arrive at the mind through the windows of the senses. If we did not have senses, for example, eyes to see, ears to hear, a mouth to taste, the foods with which the organism ingests, then would what is called the physical world exist for us? If we did not have senses, then would the physical world exist for us? Clearly not. Absolutely not. Life reaches us in the form of impressions, and it is precisely there where the possibility of working upon ourselves exists. We have to comprehend the work that we should do. How can we achieve a psychological transformation of ourselves? By carrying out a work on the impressions at the moment in which we are receiving them. This first work receives the name of the first conscious shock and is related with these impressions, which are everything that we know of the external world. So we could say that this is very important now, especially because there was a moment when we could trust photography, video, right, recordings. But now they have technology where they can even live stream things and change what's being said. And I think they call them deep fakes or something like that. So they can have a person who looks like they're talking, but they replace the mouth with somebody else. And it can be a political figure or whomever, and have them saying something different. And using their voice, I think they catalog their words that they say, and then the computer can dynamically generate it from those recordings or some other way. So it's important to say, when we see things, well, I saw so-and-so said this, or I saw this, or I saw on the news that. It doesn't mean that, because differentiate, right? That doesn't mean that's what they said, but that's what we saw. That was the impression that we received. We need to transform ourselves internally each day. When we want to transform our psychological aspect, we need to work upon the impressions which enter into us. Why do we call the work of the transformation of impressions the first conscious shock? Because a shock is something that we should not observe in a merely mechanical fashion. This could never be done in a mechanical manner. One needs a self-conscious effort. So you see here, we're learning some terminology, right? If we want to change, if we want to stop being mechanical, then we need to make a special effort, a self-conscious effort, which gives ourselves a shock to the human machine. It is clear that when one begins to comprehend this work, one begins to cease being the mechanical person who only serves the purposes of nature. If you now think about the significance of everything that you are being taught in these classes, by means of your own efforts, beginning with the observation of oneself, then you will see that on the practical side of the esoteric work, everything is intimately related with the transformation of impressions and with what results from this transformation. Right? If somebody yells at me, how do I handle that? Well, if I understand that it's an impression that I'm receiving, it makes it a lot easier to transform it, to handle it. The work, for example, on negative emotions, on angry states, on identification, on self-consideration, on the successive I's or egos, on lying, on self-justification, on excuses, on the unconscious states in which we are, is all related with the transformation of impressions and what results from it. It will be convenient for the work upon oneself to be compared with dissection. It is necessary to form an element of change at the place of the entry of the impressions. By comprehending the esoteric work, we can accept life itself as work, and then we will really enter a constant state of self-remembering. The transformation of impressions will lead us to a better life, and untransformed impressions will no longer act upon us as they did before. But as long as we continue thinking in the same manner, receiving life in the same manner, then it is clear that there will be no change in us, because we're staying the same. To transform the impressions of life is to transform oneself. This totally new manner of thinking helps us to carry out such a transformation. If one does not transform oneself, nothing is achieved. Life continuously demands that we react or adapt to it. All of those reactions or adaptations form our personal life. To change one's life is to really change our own reactions. Because our reactions categorize us. We talked about this, I believe it was in part 5. That was probably part 4 of introduction, related with our interior state and our character. Exterior life reaches us as mere impressions, which incessantly force us to react in a stereotypical manner. If the reactions which form our personal life are all of a negative type, then our own life will also be negative. In that case, life consists of a successive series of negative reactions, which happen as incessant responses to the impressions from the outside world which reach the mind. Therefore, our task consists of transforming the impressions of life in such a manner that they do not provoke the same type of negative response that we've been doing before. But in order to achieve this, it is necessary to be observing oneself from instant to instant, from moment to moment. It is urgent, therefore, to be studying our own impressions. to be studying how, when the impression comes in, the different centers, the different brains, react to it. Intellect, emotions, movement, instinct, sex. What happens when we receive those impressions? Internally. Which means, and it brings us back to, observing ourselves. We cannot allow impressions to reach us in a subjective and mechanical manner. We cannot give ourselves the luxury of allowing impressions to be received mechanically. Instead, by acting in a new manner, we transform impressions, and then we begin to live consciously. The first conscious shock consists of transforming the impressions which reach us. If we manage to transform the impressions which reach the mind at the moment of entry, then we obtain marvelous results which benefit our existence. This Gnostic esoteric work should be taken at the point where the impressions enter, because otherwise they are mechanically distributed to wrong places by the personality in order to evoke old mechanical reactions. So let's say that as a child I was bullied a lot and people made fun of me, and so then I decided to get back at them, that I wanted to get back at them, and so I did. I started fighting with people more. Somebody said something, then I would fight with them. If I want to change, that means that I'm not going to be reacting in that way if somebody makes fun of me. It doesn't mean that I won't react, because we do need to react in some way. It just means that the way that I react is going to change. Because when I receive that impression of them making fun of me, I'm going to transform that impression and handle it in a different way inside of myself. And then when I go to react into the external world or through my organism, then it will be different in the past than what I used to do, than what my personality sort of developed as. If we throw a stone into a crystalline lake, impressions are produced in the lake, and the response of those impressions produced by the stone manifest in the form of waves which go from the center to the shore. Right? So if you throw a stone into the lake, it creates impressions, which are the waves. Now imagine the mind is a lake. Suddenly an image of a person appears. That image is like the stone of our example, which reaches the mind. The mind reacts in the form of impressions. The impressions are what is produced when the image reaches the mind, and the reactions are the responses to such impressions. If a ball is thrown against the wall receives the impressions. Then the reaction follows, which is the return of the ball to the one who sent it. The ball bounces back, and that is the reaction. The world is formed by impressions. For example, the image reaches our mind through the senses. We cannot say that the table has arrived into our mind, or that the table has entered our brain, but the image of the table is inside us. Then the mind reacts by saying, this is a wooden table or a metal table, etc. There are impressions which are not so pleasant, such as the words of an offender. But we can transform the words of an offender, right? Words are as they are. Therefore, what can we do? We can transform the impressions which such words produce in us. The Gnostic teaching tells us how to crystallize the second force, that is, the Christ in us, through the postulate which says one has to receive with pleasure the unpleasant manifestations of our fellow human beings. Or one has to learn to pleasantly receive the unpleasant manifestations of our fellow human beings. We have to pleasantly receive the unpleasant manifestations of our fellow human beings. In the previous postulate, we find the way to transform impressions, those impressions of the words of an offender, and what they produce in us. Receive with gladness the unpleasant manifestations of our fellow men. This postulate will naturally lead us to the crystallization of the second force, the second logos, the Christ, within ourselves. It will cause the Christ to come and to take shape in us. If we only know the impressions from the physical world, then in reality, the physical world is not as external as people believe it to be. With just reason, Immanuel Kant said, "The exterior is the interior." If the exterior is what matters, then we should therefore transform. If the interior is what matters, right? Because Kant said the exterior is the interior. If the interior is what matters, then we should therefore transform the interior. The impressions are interior because all objects and things, everything that we see, exists in our interior in the form of impressions. If we do not transform impressions, nothing will change in us because we'll keep reacting in the same mechanical way. Lust, covetousness, pride, hatred, etc. exist in the form of impressions which vibrate incessantly within our psyche. The mechanical result of such impressions have been all of those inhuman elements that we carry within, and that we have normally called I or ego, but which in their mass constitute the myself, the oneself. Let us suppose, for example, that a man sees a provocative woman and that he does not transform those impressions. The result will be the same, that the same impressions of a lustful type will produce in him the desire of possessing her. Such a desire is the result of the impression received, and it crystallizes, it takes shape in our psyche and becomes one more aggregate, in other words, one more inhuman element, a new type of lustful I or ego, which adds itself to the sum of inhuman elements which in their totality constitute the ego. Anger, covetousness, lust, envy, pride, laziness, and gluttony exist in us. Why? Why anger? Because many impressions reached us. They reached our interior, and we never transformed them. The mechanical result of such impressions of anger form the I's or egos which exist and vibrate in our psyche and which constantly make us feel angry. Why covetousness or greed? Well, undoubtedly, many things awakened covetousness or greed in us. Money, jewels, material things of all type, etc. Those things, those objects, reached us in the form of impressions. We committed the error of not having transformed those impressions into different things, into an attraction for beauty, into happiness, etc. Such non-transformed impressions naturally became the I or ego of greed, which we now carry in our interior. Why lust? Different forms of lust reached us in the form of impressions. In other words, there surged in the interior of our mind images of an erotic type whose reaction was lust. Since we did not transform those lustful waves, that unhealthy eroticism, then naturally new morbid I's or egos were born in our psyche. Therefore, today, we have to work on the impressions which we may have in our interior and on their mechanical results. Within we have the impressions of anger, covetousness, gluttony, pride, laziness, and lust. We also have within the mechanical results of such impressions. A bunch of quarrelsome and loud-mouthed I's or egos, psychic aggregates, which we now need to comprehend and eliminate. The work of our life consists, 1, in knowing how to transform impressions, and 2, in knowing how to eliminate the mechanical results of the impressions which were not transformed in the past. Because this ability to transform impressions and to transform those memories of impressions and the results of the untransformed impressions, which are the egos, will allow us to change who and what we are, and therefore change how we react and change the way we exist. The exterior world does not exist in the way that people think it does. What really does exist are impressions of the external world. And these impressions are interior. And the reactions to such impressions are completely interior as well. No one could say that they are seeing a tree in itself. They may be seeing the image of a tree or smelling the scent of a tree, but not the tree in itself. The thing in itself, as Immanuel Kant said, is not seen by anyone. One sees the image of things. In other words, the impression of a tree, of a thing, surges in us, and these impressions are internal. They are in the mind. If one does not carry out one's own internal modifications, then the result will be that the birth of new I or ego is produced, which comes to enslave our essence, our consciousness, even more, which increases the intensity of the sleep in which we live, and therefore the suffering which we produce. When one really comprehends all that exists within oneself related to the physical world, and that what exists are nothing but impressions, then one also comprehends the necessity of transforming those impressions, and upon doing so, the transformation of oneself is produced. There is nothing that hurts more than the words of an offender. But if one is capable of transforming the impressions which such words produce in us, then they remain without any value. In other words, they remain like a check drawn against insufficient funds. Right? A check that bounces because there's nothing behind it. Certainly, the words of an insulter do not have any more value than that which the insulted person gives them. Therefore, if the insulted person does not give them any importance, then they remain like a check that bounces. When we comprehend this, we then transform the impressions of such words into something different, into love, into compassion for the insulter. And this naturally means transformation. Therefore, we need to be incessantly transforming impressions, not only the present ones, but also those of the past and the future. In the next class, we're going to talk more about the need to transform impressions. But for now, you should begin to understand how the different states of the egos, which we mentioned at the beginning of the class, are related to the impressions we receive mechanically, or untransformed impressions. So that's the end of what we wanted to review with you today, related with our initial study of impressions. Next class, we'll study more about them and about the benefits of transforming impressions within our human organism and what that does. But for now, we want to open it up for questions and comments. If you have any, please feel free to submit them in the comment area. You're welcome. We have a thank you. We want to thank you guys also for your attention, for hanging in there with this class. I know sometimes the material can be very intense and very, it requires a lot of attention to follow it. And so we appreciate that. We appreciate that you made the effort to do that. And it will pay off. We want to also invite you to tomorrow's meditation at the same time. We'll be doing another meditation for approximately 1 hour, as well as to next week's class. Or no, actually we won't have one next week because in the United States we're celebrating Thanksgiving. And so we won't have a class next week. It'll be the following week. Question, what books would you suggest on Gnosticism other than the Gnostic Gospels? There's a really good book called Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution by Peter Ouspensky. The Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution. And there's another one called, what's more complex, but it's called In Search of the Miraculous by the same author. I'll reply so you have so you can copy and paste it. That's a really good book, and Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution, because it's kind of thin, so it makes it a lot easier to get through it. Some of the material can be difficult. After that, there's one called Revolutionary Psychology by Samael and Weor. That's really good. Yeah, there's a lot of good books. Pistis Sophia is a good book. There's a really good website called Glorian.org, as well as we have the Gnostic Studies website. There's a lot of material on there as well. Kind of depends on what you want to get into related with Gnosticism. All right, another thank you. You're welcome, and thank you guys for your attention again, for your awareness, being here with us. And we want to again invite you to tomorrow's meditation. But for now, we're gonna sign off and wish you the best in your esoteric work. Hopefully, you can join us tomorrow. If not, have good Thanksgiving if you're celebrating that next week. And if we don't see you or talk to you tomorrow, then we'll see you in 2 weeks.